we got to clue this all up. So I want to bring in a special guest. Joining me right now is relationship trauma expert and CEO at Life Counseling Solutions, Dr. Janie Lacy. Doctor, thank you so much for joining me this evening to help us clear some of this up.
Absolutely. Good to be here, Michael.
All right. So what we just heard is a good starting point, because I thought it was interesting testimony. I think ultimately today some of his testimony took a little bit of a beating in the rebuttal case by Dr. Shaw, but we'll get to that in a minute. But let's talk about this sort of the correlation between borderline personality disorder and battered woman syndrome. Is it possible for a practicing psychiatrist to make that mistake? Are they that closely aligned?
When we look at borderline personality disorder, we're looking at 9 criteria and they have to meet 5. But when we're also looking at some hallmarks of borderline personality, we're looking at emotional regulation, patterns of thinking, and impulse control. But what happens with battered women, or battered people in particular, is that there's some PTSD symptoms that occur. And we're looking at it from the short term versus a long term. And in cases of long term PTSD symptoms that come through these abusive relationships, sometimes, not always, the victim can have these violent outbursts against the abuser. So my suspicion would be is focusing on some of those types of traits that are coming out to make sense of things. But there are some differences here. And when we're looking at borderline personality disorder, we're looking at some other factors that are in play versus just taking out a few potential highlights. But when we're looking at the battered syndrome in particular, we're looking at more PTS symptoms, more short-term versus long-term, and there's some key differences there. But there are some overlaps that I can tell you, Michael, when it comes to those types of things. But you have to do a thorough evaluation of the individual to really make that distinction.
Let me ask you this. You're mentioning short-term, long-term. These folks were together probably beginning 2016 to 2018 or so. So 2 years, would that be considered long-term or short-term in terms of her experience with domestic violence with Johnny Depp?
So when we look at long-term versus short-term, we're looking at acute versus 6 months and more, and there's a pattern that occurs versus just a problem that occurs. So when we're making those distinctions, we're looking at the totality of the relationship, and we're looking at the dynamics and the patterns that occur between the parties. But in particular, with someone that has borderline personality disorder, I mean, there's lots of different criteria that occur, but where it happens for someone who has battered syndrome, battered women syndrome, for example, is there in the acute phase, there's more hiding, there's more isolation, there's more fear-driven, there's preoccupation. And then in the long term, that's where we can sometimes see the outbursts of anger or having these moments of explosion to the abuser in particular.
Oh, I want to check in on that. Right now, though, I want to listen to some sound. This involves Amber Heard and some of the things that she's done to Johnny Depp, but I think caused a little bit of a problem for her. Let's take a listen, then we'll discuss it.
I didn't punch you, by the way. I'm sorry that I didn't hit you across the face in a proper slap, but I was hitting you. It was not punching you. Babe, you're not punched.
Don't tell me what it feels like to be punched.
You know, you've been in a lot of fights. You've been around a long time. I know. Yeah.
No, when you have a closed face.
You didn't get punched. You got hit. I'm sorry I hit you like this, but I did not punch you. I did not deck you. I was hitting you. I don't know what the motion of my actual hand was, but you're fine. I did not hurt you. I did not punch you. I was hitting you.
How are your toes?
What am I supposed to do? Do this? I'm not sitting here bitching about it, am I? You are. Oh. That's the difference between me and you. You're a baby.
Because you start.
You are such a baby. Grow up, Johnny.
All right, doctor, you know, part of the problem for Amber Heard overall is that she doesn't sound like a victim. There are these violent outbursts, but it's interesting. I hear that could be symptomatic of what might have been going on.
Well, I have not worked with Amber or Johnny, so let me say that first. But in cases of a lot of the women that I have worked with that will fall on the spectrum of a personality disorder, as well as being abusers themselves versus those that are true victims, and there are true victims. But when we're looking at women, I think sometimes this is a new conversation for a lot of people, and it makes a lot of people uncomfortable, Michael, and that's the case of women actually being the abusers. And sometimes the argument will be, well, I can never hurt him, but right, abuse comes in many different forms. Abuse can come in the form of mental, emotional, right, psychological. There's manipulation that occurs. There's so many ways in which women can also be abusers, and sometimes that can be confused, especially if they're looking at it from a physical standpoint. But when we're looking at these abusive relationships, a lot of the toxic, I work with a lot of high conflict couples, it doesn't always necessarily result in physical abuse either. So that's where these lines are very blurred when we're looking at some of these cases where domestic violence occurs. So where there's abuse and where there are other things that are part of the relationship, it doesn't always necessarily come out as physical abuse, but sometimes it may.
I want to talk about mutual abuse because I think, again, one of the things that's come out of this case is that these two folks abused each other, whether, again, it be verbal, physical. I think it's clear that things have happened between this couple. But we also heard testimony that there's no such thing as mutual abuse. It's not accepted in the scientific community, that there's an aggressor, someone who has more of the power and control, and then there's reactive violence. Where do you stand on that issue? Do you think that you can have a relationship where there's mutual abuse, clearly both sides at one time or another, the aggressor, or does there have to be one aggressor and someone else sort of reactive violence?
Well, what happens in these cases where both parties are abusive to each other? And I've worked with many of them with high conflict couples. So I can tell you without a doubt, it happens. But what happens is there's bi-directional, right? We're looking at certain points in times in the relationship where someone is vying for that victim position. We look at what we call the Cartman's triangle. It's the toxic abuse cycle that happens, right? So there's going to be someone who's a victim, there's going to be a rescuer, and then there's going to be a prosecutor. And anytime in the same relationship, the couple can constantly be vying for that victim position. But what happens is there's lots of control that happens, competition, there's constant conflict, and at any point in time, they can change roles. It's bi-directional, and it's not necessarily throughout. So we're looking at it from a victim standpoint. There is a dominant person that is vying for that control constantly throughout the relationship. But we're looking at relationships where they are, using the term mutually abusive to each other. It's go here, come here. They're constantly changing that position that occurs. And there's a trauma bond that occurs actually in that type of dynamic. So sometimes we'll hear our couples, Michael, say, well, I can't leave, but I can't stay either. I love you, I hate you. And they're constantly doing this back and forth dance. And it doesn't necessarily mean that one is in a power position. It means they're both vying for that power position.
Just that tragic dance. We're seeing it in this case, I would imagine, very clearly. There's one other thing I want to bring up, and it's Dr. Spiegel's testimony, and it's something that I took away from it. Johnny Depp, he says, he has admitted to drinking, partaking in drugs, but Spiegel says that Depp's cluster of issues correlate directly to a higher likelihood of domestic abuse. I want to listen, then I want to get your thoughts on it.
In my opinion, based on my review of the evidence, based on my clinical experience, based on my publishing experience, based on my teaching experience, that Mr. Depp has behaviors that are consistent with both someone who has a substance use disorder as well as consistent behaviors for someone who is a perpetrator of intimate partner violence.
All right, so now today on rebuttal, they called Dr. Shaw, who talked about the fact that correlation, there's no correlation. You can get a cohort of people who have all of these things, tells you nothing about whether they're going to be someone who commits domestic violence. Your thoughts on this issue?
I agree with that. Just because someone has a challenge with addictive behavior or substance abuse or alcohol abuse, it doesn't necessarily, with some of the other clusters that he talked about on the stand, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to engage in intimate violent situations in their relationship. However, sometimes we'll see in intimate partner violence, when we look backwards, there sometimes are abuse issues that occur as far as substance and alcohol abuse. But if that's the baseline, it doesn't always result in someone being abusive to their partner. There are plenty of couples where there's one partner who is seeking treatment for their addiction, and they actually, when we look at fight or flight that occurs when the conflict happens, they're trying to get away versus fight, so to speak, which can potentially result in intimate violence between the couple, for example. So I agree with today's testimony in a sense that there is lots of different research that's out there and peer-reviewed journal that shows that it's not necessarily correlated with one or the other.
All right, one last quick question. I need a quick answer here. Was it unethical for Dr. Spiegel to testify the way he did, as suggested by Dr. Shaw?
In my professional opinion, absolutely. When we are rendering diagnosis or we're giving a professional opinion, we can use information given by family and friends, but we can't use that information without the direct interview or assessment of that person that we are diagnosing. It is unethical, in my opinion.
All right, well, Dr. Lacy, I truly appreciate it. I can tell you, right now I have a much clearer view of things, and that's thanks to you. So really appreciate you joining us tonight. Hopefully you'll come back and join us again.
Thank you, Michael.
All right, you have a great evening. All right, folks, this is a big week in the Depp versus Heard defamation trial with several witnesses expected to take the stand.